Hello again. I know it's late, but I had some things I needed to do. And by needed, I mean I chose to do them because I felt like it. So even if they weren't exactly needed, I still did them, and thus, this video has been delayed. Now I've got today's and tomorrow's topics prepared already, for the sake of ease, so I don't waste paper. So today, let's talk about why credentials do not change ethical rules. Needless to say, my ethics class is once again annoying me, and so forgive me while I rant to you. But let's start with the basics. An ethical model must be internally consistent. For example, this must be the same thing no matter what. Internally. Think about it. When you're doing finance, you don't log a quarter as a penny. A quarter must always be a quarter and equal to 25 cents. The value of the cent may change, but the specific principles and rules regarding them must stay the same. This quarter must always be a quarter. It cannot be a penny, a dime, a nickel, whatever. Things must be internally consistent within the rule set. The popularity of a thinker does not change the ethical conclusions of said models. For example, let's take Sigmund Freud as an example for psychology. It doesn't matter how popular Freud is. The conclusions he reached using his research were fundamentally true or false based on scientific data. His popularity does not play a role. The same is true in ethics. Because your goal is to hammer down what is right or wrong based on a set of already determined principles, the popularity of a thinker does not suddenly change those principles, and thus their conclusions from it. If you accept points A, B, and C, then the logical conclusions of those points must be reached. For example, if individuals of the same moral value have the same moral responsibilities because of said value, then they must be held to account for the same actions. That's what must happen. Why? Because if they're equivalent, and thus have the same responsibilities, then the results of their outcomes must be the same. For example, I kill a person. I must be judged the same regardless of my wealth or social status. That person's social status that I killed does not matter either. All that matters is that a person was knowingly killed by me, and thus the ethical conclusion must be reached irregardless of whether or not a popular thinker says yes or no. They can say whatever. It does not matter. What matters is that you follow the internal principles of the model. And you must follow said ethical model to its logical conclusions. For example, let's take utilitarianism. The greatest good for the greatest many. Of course, if you're factoring in sentient beings, like cows, that are sentient in terms of feeling, but not necessarily reason, then you must also conclude that to sacrifice a few for many is acceptable even within those animals. So for example, if you kill 2 cows to save 10, that is acceptable, because it is the greatest good for the greatest many. Gaining the pleasure of 10 cows at the expense of 2 is also acceptable by its logical conclusions. And thus you can kill animals under specific circumstances. If you instead follow that animals are equivalent to humans, then you must also hold that they deserve the same responsibilities as humans, or hold the same weight. Thus their actions carry the same consequences and must be judged by the same standards. Is that not the logical conclusion of such a thought? I'd say it is. And then finally, actually there's 2 more. Credentials do not define knowledge of a subject. A person could be fully credentialed and still be completely off base. There was a famous Russian scientist, I forgot his name, apologies, but he worked in the agricultural field. It might be Kerensky, but I'm probably mistaken. And his entire theory was essentially that if we treated crops like we do people, and thus collectivize them, and collectivism is good, because remember, communist, then we can reduce the amount of resources needed to produce the same amount of grain or other produce. Now, of course, he was completely wrong on this, but he was credentialed technically. And his knowledge of the subject was completely off base, but he still held the credentials. He was still a top Soviet advisor for a while, actually. Knowledge of a subject is defined by the research one proves and does. Ethics is no different. You could have studied everything to know about ethics, but if you actively ignore the basics of deontological thought, natural law theory, consequentialism, and all the other methods that one can judge ethics, then you are not knowledgeable on the subject. Because just because you have credentials does not suddenly make you qualified. Credentials indicate you've studied, not that you've remembered. And that's an important difference. I could study something for 20 years, and if I forget everything, it doesn't matter how much I've studied, because I don't know it. I forgot it. That's the thing. And it's very important when it comes to these situations. And especially with ethics, you gotta remember how the rules function. And finally, arguing on the basis of credentials and/or popularity is an appeal to authority. Even in ethics, you are not suddenly excused from being questioned because you are an authority. Nor do you define what a thing is because you are an authority. That is how things work. I do not care if you are the most popular man in the room. I should not care if you're the most popular man in the room. If you cannot follow your own conclusions to their logical endpoints, then you are not correct, because you haven't completed the logic, the circuit. If there's a point A and point B and you stop in the middle, then you have not completed the circuit. You have not finished the equation. And thus, you are not correct. Your credentials, your popularity, how many books you've written, how popular they are, how many people you've spoken to, it all means nothing if you cannot back it up. So if someone just says, this person's a global renowned blah da 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 da, that means nothing. Some dude named Peter Singer, for example, he can be completely wrong. Completely and utterly wrong. That doesn't change his credentials. It doesn't change his popularity. If he is right or wrong, it is independent of his global renown, popularity, or any credentials based on the universities he studied at. He can regurgitate 87 things about how many people know him, how many books he's written, yada yada yada. But if his model is internally inconsistent, then it is flatly wrong. And thus, from there, incorrect. That is the thing with ethical rules. They must maintain internal consistency at all times. Emotions do not play that role. They cannot play a role, fundamentally. Because to judge ethics on emotional response is not rational, and ethics relies on reason and empirical data. Because you're prescripting things, and you're trying to say, all right, given these principles that I hold, and this end goal I seek, maintaining the rules or achieving the greatest good for the greatest many, whatever it is, given these principles, given what I know, and given the end goal, what should be done? That is the goal. That is the objective intent of the person. And notice, emotions do not play a role there. You may end for more emotional joy, but for everything else, complete non-factor. Completely irrelevant. It does not matter how many people will cry if the end goal is achieving point A. Anything else does not matter. So long as it furthers it, and it's internally consistent, it functions. And if it works within an already established framework, for example, utilitarianism, then it is correct according to it. If the logic is internally consistent, then it functions. If it functions, then it is an ethical model that works. And thus, an acceptable one. Your credentials don't change that. I could be completely without college education. I could be without middle school education even. High school education too. None of it. If my models maintain internal consistency, follow the model to its conclusions, and does not change because of the popularity of someone who disagrees, then that is an effective ethical model to be preserved, or at the very least acknowledged as functional, and not as wrong. If I can take utilitarianism, apply its logic, and get a result that is logically consistent and does not break the internal consistency of the model itself, that is acceptable, and it is still utilitarianism. Even if Singer disagrees, even if every other utilitarian disagrees, so long as it maintains internal consistency and follows the conclusions of said internal model, then it is fine. That is what is needed. Credentials do not change the rules of an ethical model. Peter Singer saying, A, I believe this, B, this, C, this, does not change the basic principles of utilitarianism, nor does it change the basics of consequentialism. All it does is take one specific section of belief and put them to their logical conclusions through a specific route. And people like that route, or sympathize with it. Either way, complete irrelevance. So long as my beliefs maintain internally consistent, they're fine. So long as his maintain internal consistency, they're fine. And so long as they follow the same ethical model, they are both under that ethical model. They are just different approaches achieving similar goals. If one disagrees, feel free to explain it to me. I will argue with you till I'm blue in the face. Frankly, that would probably blow off some steam. But that'll be all for today. Thank you for watching.